Okay, so these are the notes for the last and final chapter of the novel. As the slides progress, you can pause it so that you can take your notes and take your time with it, and then just continue to press play so that you can hear what I have to say about the notes. We finally got the audio working. It's just me emphasizing what the notes mean and extending some of the ideas that are put on the slides. Okay, so in the final chapter of The Great Gatsby, Nick notes that Gatsby had actually made Daisy a symbol of everything he was destined to have. She was actually valued more than what she really was through Gatsby's eyes. So Nick says, what a grotesque thing a rose is. And so he's suggesting here that a rose is only seen as beautiful because the rest of the world or people have chosen to give it the attribute of beauty. Whereas, anybody else from, say, another planet could potentially look at a rose and see it as ugly. But in our society, in our community, and we as humans see roses as beautiful because that's how we have chosen to see it, and so that's the value it's been given. This is similar to Daisy, and this is how Nick uses to describe Daisy, that, Gatsby had given her more value than she actually is worth. She really is just a, shallow young woman who cares more about her material wealth and status than anything else. And Nick suggests that had Gatsby not given her such value, all that would be left of Daisy would be an idle, bored, rich young woman who has no particular moral strength or loyalty. She's only seen as this valuable commodity to Gatsby because he has sort of given her all these attributes of beauty and everything his dreams were made up of. But really, in reality, she wasn't all that worth it. And this can also relate to the 1920s American society that was devoid of real meaning, real value, and beauty. It became a world where dreams were exposed as illusions, and corrupt things and corrupt people sort of took over what was morally good and noble. So, for example, unfeeling men and bullies such as Tom Buchanan received the love of women who are longed for by good men like Gatsby and Wilson. So, throughout the novel, as Nick describes New York, he illustrates it as a land that really embodies contrasting values in his eyes. But in the end of the book, in chapter 9, he also compares it to the Midwest, where he's from. The Midwest is a place that he believes to be quite dreary. It's quite pedestrian, meaning it's quite slow-paced. And, it really is the opposite of the excitement that's going on in the East. However, the East is merely a glittering surface. And what is lacking is that moral center that is still prevalent in places such as the Midwest, but have completely lost their meaning in places like New York. And we've talked about this all throughout the novel, that the one thing that was missing from the American society as the economy soared, as materialism took on a new turn, and it was all about pleasure, was that people forgot how to be good people, how to be moral. And this moral depravity is actually what dooms the characters of The Great Gatsby and leads them to failure. And Nick notes that all of them, even the Buchanans and even James Gatsby, who is from North Dakota, are all Midwesterners, and they were unable to adapt to this society, to this new corrupt place and world and way of living that New York had to offer, that it either ate them up and swallowed them whole, spat them out, or left them dead. And this sense of distortion that lures people and seduces them to the East eventually disgusts Nick at the end of the novel, and it actually is what forces him to decide to move back to Minnesota. He realizes that as much as he was seduced by it, much like he was seduced by Jordan Baker, he's still very much disgusted by this way of life and by this society, and decides that he'd rather be in a slow-paced, dull community like the Midwest than a place like the East where he can't stand the people and he can't stand the lack of morals. Now, throughout history, especially during this particular time in history when America became one of the powerhouse nations in the world and one of the great winners of the war, the West was seen as a land of promise and possibility. America was where you can achieve all you had hoped for in life. And that was the very emblem of the American dream and the American ideals. However, when we read the book, we meet characters like Tom and Daisy and other members of the upper class in the East Egg who betray America's democratic ideals by perpetuating the rigid class structure that still is in place for them. And this class structure excludes newcomers like Gatsby and the rest of the new rich society from reaching their upper class levels. So think of the Sloanes in chapter 6, I believe it was, where they were polite enough to Gatsby's face, but obviously shown enough disdain for him to just rudely leave him in his own living room before he even got a chance to come with them to dinner as they had invited him to. So they still turned their noses up at people who didn't possess this aristocratic background and, this sort of wealthy lineage of family. If you weren't from that class, you were still different. And that really did take away this whole notion that anybody can become equals under the American society and that anyone can equally achieve their dreams if they wanted to. Now, Gatsby was a dreamer. And what was so great about him was the fact that he had the audacity and the nobility of spirit to dream of creating a radically different future for himself. He was able to take his identity and turn it around completely so that he created the person he wanted to be. He created the identity he wanted for himself. However, his final dream ends in failure, and this does so for several reasons. One, he has his tragic flaws, and one of his tragic flaws is the fact that his methods were criminal. Two, he can never gain acceptance into the American aristocracy that the Buchanans were a part of. And this is something he'd have to do in order to win over Daisy. There seems to be this impossible social divide that's separating Gatsby and Daisy, which ironically is part of her allure for him. But this divide also demonstrates the drastic different backgrounds and social contexts that they're coming from. And because of that, they can't be together. Or because of that, Daisy would never choose to leave her higher status to be with a new rich member like Gatsby. So Gatsby's failure to realize that is also a part of his sort of tragic flaw. And also, it's important to note that Gatsby, even though he recreated himself and was able to turn his life around and make himself the person he wants to be, he still puts on a large act for everyone else. He goes on to tell people that he's from Oxford, that he comes from a wealthy family, and he's from San Francisco. So everything about him is still a false act. So, what Fitzgerald's novel does is it questions the idea of an America where all things are possible if one simply tries hard enough. That remains a very huge question mark at the end of the novel. Is it possible? Because, as this book demonstrates, it clearly is not. In Nick's eyes, Gatsby represents someone who has the ability to dream, to escape the past. That may ultimately be impossible. However, Nick cherishes and values this optimism that Gatsby has, even though he knows quite well enough that Gatsby won't be able to escape the past completely. And what The Great Gatsby really does for the narrator, Nick Carraway, is it illustrates his struggle to integrate his own sense of importance of the past with the freedom from the past that's envisioned by Gatsby. There's this whole struggle of, do we want to be free from the past? Yes, we do. But how can we completely want to be able to free ourselves from the past if we're still holding on to so much of it? And that's the irony with Gatsby himself. He escaped from his past, his poor, social class, but he held on to the past in which he fell in love with Daisy. And it was that struggle, that back and forth struggle, that really embodied the characters, and particularly Gatsby in the novel. So those are all the notes for this particular chapter. It's not very long because obviously it was just one chapter. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and hopefully I can answer them for you.